I have to say I was disappointed, Murdo, because you said it's not particularly radical, and I was expecting there to be blood and fights and guts, and so maybe we're not going to see that this afternoon. But
I'm sure we could do that if you want.
No. Let me stop talking. Let me open the floor actually straight away and ask if anyone's got a question they would like to ask. Bearing in mind the context where we are, there's a bill, you might want to ask about that. You might want to ask about something a bit wider than that. All I would ask of you is, if you want to ask a question, if you say your name and maybe a little bit, just what you do or what your context is here today. That would be really helpful. Thank you. So, who's going to go first? Don't be shy. Jamie.
Jamie Williamson, Laird of Alvey. Very interested in your agricultural tenancies, and would you be able to elaborate on how we're going to lance the boil of the agricultural tenancy problem?
Well, I'm obviously not in a position to preempt what's going to come out in the committee's report on Friday. In fact, the report won't be finished until Wednesday morning, when we meet to do our final sort of look at it. But it's something, in my view, that needs to be dealt with. I think if it's just left and doesn't change, I think it will lead to a continuation of what we've seen up until now. And I'm not convinced personally that the new modern limited duration tenancies are going to do very much for anyone. There doesn't seem to have been much enthusiasm in the evidence we've had for them. And I feel we need to tackle it in a pretty positive way that would be fair to both sides. And I'm hoping that the committee will agree to recommend to the government to have a look at that. But I can't really say any more than that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, just doing a broad comment. I mean, I'm no expert in agricultural holdings, and you would have to be a specialist to understand the intricacies of this. I think where everybody agrees with us is that we need to have more land available to let, because having a vibrant tenancy sector is the way you bring new entrants into farming. And we have a big problem in Scottish farming. The average age is what, 60 now? More than that, yeah, for Scottish farmers. If you don't have a family farm, you don't come from a farming background, you don't have the capital to get into farming. So your way in is to get a tenancy. If you look at the number of tenancies that are being offered or have been offered in recent years, they've dwindled away almost to nothing. Part of that has been because a lot of landlords have been very concerned about the debate around absolute right to buy, for example, and they thought, well, if we grant a tenancy, we're a bit worried the government might come in and retrospectively change the rules, give a tenant the right to buy, and we lose property that is ours, an asset that is ours, to the sitting tenant. And I said a little bit earlier about the law of unintended consequences, and I think this is a very good demonstration of politicians trying to be helpful, trying to do the right thing, and passing laws that actually make matters worse, because it actually raises concerns and does the opposite to that intended. So it makes it harder for people to get land to let. So I don't know what the answer is, I have to confess. It's precisely for that, I don't know what the answer is, but I think you have to be very careful about the law of unintended consequences, because the more you try and interfere with this, potentially the more difficult it is for the supply of let land to become available. And everybody agrees that needs to be the objective. Yeah.
I think one of the things we have to bear in mind is that these Section 91 secure tenancies were first created in 1948, just after the war. And the reason they were created was to encourage people to go onto the land to produce food, because it had become apparent during the war, Second World War, years that we weren't. Food security was an issue. And the rights of assignation to successors was very, very wide at that time, very wide. Wider than what the bill is now proposing. Could almost assign their secure tenancy to anybody. Over the years, those rights were reduced, mainly by Conservative governments, I would have to say, in Westminster, to where they are now, where it's very tight. And what you have seen is the number of secure tenancies under the 1991 Act have been steadily reducing year on year on year. And there's no doubt in my mind that there are certain landowners are actively making life very difficult for their secure tenants to force them out, to force them to give up their tenancies. That's happening. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I'm not saying everybody's doing that, I'm not saying a majority is doing that, but it's happening. And you only have to look at the continued reduction in tenancies to realise what's actually going on. Because most landowners don't want perpetual tenancies. That was a phrase that was used in front of the committee by certain witnesses. Perpetual tenancies devalue the landlord's land in terms of how much they can get for it. If there's no secure tenant, the land is worth more to the landlord. And that is why these landlords want to get rid of secure tenants. Now, I don't quite understand why that should be the case, because if you've got a secure tenant paying you 40, 50, 60,000 a year rent, that's pretty good security, I would have thought. But that's the sort of argument that you will get. And there's a real conundrum here. I'm not sure if you can actually achieve both aims of getting more land to be let and also increasing tenants' rights. I'm not sure if you can actually do that, if that's actually possible. And it's something we need to look at very, very carefully indeed. But I do believe we need to do something fairly drastic to try to solve the issue in a way that would allow everybody to move forward.
But is it not the case that this proposed legislation doesn't go nearly as far as it could down that road, because there is no proposal in the bill for an absolute right to buy of a 1991 style tenant, and the government, if it wanted to, could push that a lot further. Is that not the case?
The government could, and they might be encouraged to.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to predict what might happen on Friday, you see. I'm trying to preempt things, Dave. Get things from you here that we'll read about in the press on Saturday morning.
I need to watch what I say. My convener will not be very happy with me. It's something that needs to be dealt with. There's no doubt about that. It's not proposed in the bill. And I don't think anybody, and Murdo mentioned there's a fear among some landowners that if they let land, not under secure tenancies, just let land in the normal course, that these might be turned into secure tenancies and the landlord then loses that land. I don't think there's any danger of that. And I think one of the things that would be a pointer towards that is the 2003 Act, where a very late amendment was brought in by Ross Finney, the Minister at the time, to solve a problem that he perceived where landowners were issuing notices to tenants to try and preempt the effect of the 2003 Act. And that totally backfired. It was brought in, rushed at the last minute, and I can understand why it was done by the government at that time. But it's led to a situation now where we've got a number of tenants who, the appeals went through the courts and everything else, and it was found that it wasn't compatible with the ECHR. And any legislation in the Scottish Parliament must be compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. It's written into the Scotland Bill. We don't have the luxury that Westminster would have to ignore that if they chose. We are absolutely bound by it. So anything we do must be ECHR compliant. And that has come through very strongly in the evidence we've received on the bill. So that was an attempt to try and change things that backfired. I don't know of any politician in the SNP or anywhere else who is arguing that non-secure tenancies should be turned into secure tenancies. And personally, one of the first political meetings I attended was in the Black Isle at the hotel at Toa, back in 1992, I think it was. And with the tenant farmers, SDFA people, they were only getting going then on their campaign. And that was about getting a right to buy for secure tenants. And it's taken a long time to get where we are. And I'm not sure where it will end up. But something needs to be done to deal with this point. Otherwise, it's just going to lead to continued frustration and worry for everyone.
Jamie, you want to go?
Sorry, Murdo, were you going to respond to that? Because it's a slightly different question that I have.
Well, yeah, we'll come back to that in a minute.
Sorry.
I was wanting to ask for if there's any other views on this point, specifically around tenancies, if anyone has a question or a comment. David?
Comment more than that question with a couple rules are there. The point about tenancies and about the availability and about the value of land. And there's actually a bigger picture here which we haven't discussed, and it is Christian ethical point. It's about the building of wealth. Because the reason that an agricultural holdings, that tenancy would be valued at 50% normally about of the market value. Now, one of the reasons may be that landlords don't want to rent land, maybe not necessarily because it affects what they hold, because they still own it, regardless of what the value is, but where they're using it as collateral for other means. And that's what I've found is sometimes a big driver for not releasing and letting land is because it affects their collateral value. Not that they want to cash in on it, they just can't borrow against it.
So do you have a view about that? Do you think that's a good thing or not? Put you on the spot.
I have lots of views on it.
Okay.
There isn't an easy answer to this, and some people grandstand on both sides of the argument, and they do it all the time. But it's easy to grandstand. The difficulty is to actually come down and deliver something that works for most of the people most of the time. And there's certainly, it'll be interesting to see what comes out on Friday, because extremes on both sides won't really help it.
It seems to me that that's an example of one person or group of individuals putting their interests before the common good. Yeah, query whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing. Jamie, you will have a view on that, I'm sure.
On the common good?
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
Common good's a good thing, yeah. You were going to ask a question.
I was going to ask a question, sorry, it's slightly different, but Murdo, you raised the two issues that you thought were particularly problematic, the proposals surrounding sporting rights and succession. Now, I actually read through the bill in preparation for my session today, so I read through the bill and I didn't pick up what was particularly controversial here, so I was wondering if you could unpack what the proposals are, why they're negative, and Dave, if you would be able to respond to that, as to why that's in there.
Okay. Well, first of all, sporting rights. So historically, sporting rights in Scotland were subject to rates. The Conservative government in 1994 abolished these because the cost of collection was getting higher than they might recover, and it brought Scotland into line with the situation in the rest of the UK. And the policy is to reintroduce these. Now, this is. I talked earlier about the law of unintended consequences, and this is where it gets complicated, because people, when you talk about sporting rights, people think of a shooting estate, and they think, well, why shouldn't that pay rates like any other business? But the rates would be, as I understand it, on sporting rights. Every piece of land in rural Scotland will carry with it sporting rights. So if you have a family farm, you'll have sporting rights with that. These will suddenly become rateable. And the reason this gets complicated is because we don't have rates on agricultural land in Scotland. Some people would like to introduce them. That, as you can imagine, would not be very popular with the farming community or with many people in the rural community. And therefore you would get people who haven't paid rates at all suddenly hit with a rates bill. The other problem with this is that because we've not been rating rural land, there's a major exercise work to do in assessing the value of rural land and of the value of any sporting influence on it, which would have to be the annual rent value. So the actual bureaucracy you then need to create, set up this entire new system to create a figure. I think it's about £3 million. They will know the figure that they want to collect. Actually, the cost of setting up the collection system is probably going to cost more than they actually collect. So I do wonder, what is the point of actually doing this when already we have many rural activities, agriculture is not rated, so why bring this on? It just seems to be more motivated by the politics of envy rather than any proper good public policy behind it. The succession law changes are not in this bill, but are part of the broader land reform agenda, and the Scottish Law Commission has done some detailed work on this, and the intention is that these will be brought forward in the next Parliament. Now, this is where it gets quite complicated for non-lawyers, but essentially, if you, at the moment, in terms of Scots law, you can will your heritable property to anyone you wish. So, I have a house, I have 2 children. If I die, and assuming my wife's not around, I can leave my house to my 2 children, I can leave it to 1 child, I can leave it to the cat and dog home, I can leave it to anyone I want. The law around movable property is slightly different, because if I have movable assets, so a bank account, shares, a car, for example, my children have a claim on that. It's called legal rights, up to a half of the value of the movable right. And the discussion around succession law is to say, shouldn't we make the law around heritable property, land and buildings, more like the law on movable property to give your children a right claim? Which is an interesting proposal, and we could spend the whole rest of the day talking about the pros and cons of that. But the real challenge comes in a family farm. So if you've got a family farm and maybe anything between, 200-300 acres up to 1,000 acres, that family farm will support 1 family unit. So what tends to happen is you get a farmer who wants to pass it on to his children, say he's got 3 children. What tends to happen is the family will agree among themselves that somebody will take on the farm. And so they will have the farm left to them, and the other members of the family, there'll be some arrangement, they'll usually get some sort of payoff, but nowhere near the 1/3 value. And the farmer can then leave that to that child, and it passes on according to his will. But if you change the succession law to make heritable property treated the same as movable property, that will no longer be possible, because the other children could then claim. Which would then mean either you then have to break that farm up into parts, none of which are economically viable, or more likely the farm would then have to be sold in order to pay out the shares. So you would lose that farm. And it's one of these things which I think just hasn't been properly thought through. And you speak to the National Farmers Union, they are very, very concerned with the impact this will have on the pattern of family farming that we currently have in Scotland. But it's quite a complex issue.
Thanks, Mark. One of the things that is in the bill is the proposal, Dave, you spoke about this earlier, of Scottish Land Commission. And as I understand the draft bill, it would set the Commission's job is to set the agenda for the next 5 years, and this would be one of the key things if this is a proposal. So, Dave, two things for you to comment on. One, the accusation that it's political grandstanding, nothing more than that, to bring in the sporting rights, and secondly, in relation to the succession proposals, which aren't on the table just now, but maybe if you have a view on that, you might want to address that.
Yeah, thanks, Murray. I've never been known to grandstand politically, I don't think.
I was just speaking about you personally.
I've seen Murdo do it a few times. In fact, he was doing it just a few moments ago, if you noticed. But one of the things I think, which is fair to say about the SNP government, is that it is a government that does listen. Believe it or not, we do listen. The government does listen. And when the legislation is going through, evidence is taken. And one of the strengths, I think, of the Scottish Parliament is where we have got committees who will actually think for themselves and not just do what party whips tell them to do. And I think in the Rural Affairs Committee, you've got a committee like that. You've got people on it who are listening, who are thinking about what they're getting told. They're taking wide evidence from across the country. You're going to get on Friday a pretty good report, I think, of the committee's views on the evidence that they have heard. Some of that will back the government, some of it will be a challenge for the government. I've got no doubt about that. Murdo summed up the shooting rates issue very well, I thought. And we've had lots of evidence to support what he was saying. And that has been something that has been exercising our minds, because unintended consequences are not the kind of things you want. The trouble with unintended consequences is you don't know about them until after you've done something and then they happen. But you can try and anticipate maybe, what might happen with the evidence that you get. So I think you'll find that we'll be looking very carefully at the proposal in relation to the shooting rates as to whether it is something that would be worth doing Would it raise the money? What would the unintended consequences be? Or are there maybe better ways of actually dealing with those issues? So I've got some sympathy with what he's saying in relation to that. What it would do, I think, would probably be a bonanza for lawyers, valuers and assessors. So they're cheerleading just now for this to be brought in. So maybe that's a reason not to do it. I don't know.
Provide employment.
Indeed.
We don't have enough law.
On the succession law, it's not something I've been looking at particularly closely. I'm aware of it. I'm aware of the Scottish Law Commission report. And again, that I'm not sure what stage this is at, Murdo, but it'll be out for consultation. People will be able to put their views in. And can I just make a little point? An awful lot of folk think when the government puts a consultation out on a Scottish Law Commission report, which is an independent body that looks at these things and recommends, that is the government's view of things. It's not. The government is consulting. They want to know your views, the public's views. And people get on their high horse sometimes and start accusing the government of wanting to do this and wanting to split up family farms and wanting to destroy this sector of rural economy. No, we want to hear views. And I'm not in the government, I'm just an MSP. I'm not a government minister or anything. But they're looking for views and they will listen to those views. At the end of the day, government must decide what it's going to do. That's the job of government, and it will make its decisions based on what it's heard, but also what it thinks the country needs.
I'm very grateful, Dave, for that comment about engagement, because it's something that we are going to pick up later on as well in terms of what you can do if you have a view. And I would encourage each and every one of us, if you do have views about things, whatever it is, whether it's about land reform or whatever topic the Scottish Parliament are looking at, to take the time to read what is proposed and then to respond, because just like Dave said, it is a democratic institution and we have a fantastic opportunity, because your view is as important as the next person's view. You've got a right to express it, and it's all good in that respect, and people do listen, the MSPs do listen to that. Has anyone got a question that hasn't spoken yet? What would be burning issues? Andrew?
It's Andrew Murchison. In the theological perspectives on land, one of the points that was raised, which I thought was very interesting, was the question of a maximum area entitlement to ownership. That was one of the points that was raised as a possibility for discussion. Could you express your views as to whether you think that would be appropriate, or any other controls on who would be entitled to acquire land in Scotland, for example, parties who are based abroad, possibly as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Andrew, to answer your second point first, I think the Scottish Government did look at this as part of the bill, whether they could exclude entities not resident or registered in the EU from owning land in Scotland, and drop that from the bill, I think, because the legal advice they got was that it would be very difficult to enforce that. I don't know the ins and outs. Maybe Dave knows a bit more about the ins and outs of that than I do. In relation to the first point, I mean, this was something people proposed. There should be, nobody should be allowed to own more than X acres, And going back to what I said earlier, I just think that that's completely the wrong approach to this whole issue, because it's not about who owns the land; it's about how that land is used. And in any event, land in Scotland and indeed within the Highlands is of a very different and varied nature. You could have 10,000 acres of very wild, remote land, which you can do very little with and might actually not have a very substantial value, as against 100 acres of much more productive land, much closer to an urban centre of population, which actually is much more important in terms of economic development. So I think seeing it in terms of just bare numbers doesn't make any sense. And it's interesting the government did look at that, one of the possibilities, and in the end came to the view that just wasn't something that was sensible.
Okay.
Yeah, on the non-EU entities not being able to own land in Scotland, that isn't in the bill. The government did decide not to go down that road. I believe the sort of issues that arose was that a non-EU entry could become an EU entry in Belgium or Ireland or any of the European countries. And they all have different laws relating to land and also registration of land and a whole variety of other things. So it would potentially create all sorts of difficulties. But having said that, I don't think that anybody should have any problem in registering within Europe and even registering within Scotland. I mean, why shouldn't someone who wants to own land in Scotland not have a registrable address in Scotland that people can write to? Why can't we know who the beneficiary of that land is? That could be the registrar, could Register for Scotland, could have the right to know that and get that information. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, I think is what I'm saying. And I think there are ways that we can identify who owns the land. Because the crucial thing is, as I said when I was speaking, quite often communities will write and they'll get no response from somebody in wherever, Barbados or whatever tax haven they're in. But actually, if you look at things, it's sometimes easier to get information in these places than it is in the UK. And of course, people can set up all sorts of company structures, and I'm not a lawyer, these guys will tell you, and things can be hidden through trusts and a whole variety of different ways. So the important thing is somewhere that you know you can go to and you will get a response so that you know who is the beneficial owner of that land. And if a community wants to access a bit of land, that they're actually able to do that without being thwarted for decades. And that happens, and that has happened. So I would hope that we can do things that will make it much more transparent. It may or may not be in the forum that was originally suggested by the Land Reform Review group. In terms of a package, a maximum size or whatever, I think there are issues around that, but I think there's also an issue around the fact that 342 or whatever people own half of Scotland. I think that is a problem, that is an issue, that so few people have so much control, and it is control, and it is power over the land of Scotland. But there's various ways you can deal with that. The Community Empowerment Bill that went through last June gives communities the right to buy derelict properties and land that's not being used properly. Of course, you hit all sorts of problems with definitions of what these sort of things mean. And this legislation will allow, as I said, as well, communities to buy land where there's a problem being created at the moment. But how do you show that? How many hoops do you need to go through? The real way to deal with land ownership is to use the taxation system. It's to use the taxation system to penalise people, and this is my own opinion here, nobody else's, who are not using land well, and benefit people who are using land well. And the whole grant system, the whole Common Agricultural Programme system, the whole subsidy system benefits landowners massively. Lots of farmers get huge subsidies from the public purse, much more than the poor wee man down the road claiming tax credit will ever get. And that's fine if they're using the land properly. But there's all sorts of difficulties in defining that too. But taxation, grant systems and all that, that's how you look at that. And of course, we have certain powers in relation to Scotland. We don't have full powers. If we had full powers, I'd certainly be advocating looking at using that system to actually make sure people use land. There are examples in my constituency of estates recently which have been bought, and all of the livestock, all of the crop growing has been stopped on them, all of the tenants have been put out of their cottages because the people buying them want a nice big house and a nice huge garden, and they want all the cottages for their staff. I don't think that's good land use. I would like the power to do something about that. This bill won't deal with that, but we need to look at those issues, for those things are happening, and they are happening now.
I dare say there'll be some reaction in the audience to that statement, Dave. Thank you. Does anyone want to come back on that and say anything about that? Yeah.
Marjorie Harper, University of Aberdeen, so it's the historian's perspective. I think you've hit the nail on the head with transparency. But I think the question is, how do we achieve transparency? How best do we achieve transparency in a fallen world where so many people are out for the number one? And I think sometimes transparency is obscured by the ghosts of the past. And I think the ghosts of the people like the Duke of Sutherland stalk the corridors of power. And I wonder what the best way is to not let, to learn from history, but not to allow history to colour policy making, decision making.
Do you have a view, Marjorie, about community versus private ownership? Because it seems to me that that's one of the key areas in which this argument distills down. Because you can have good examples, very good examples, we've got them in the room, of one or two individuals who own land, and it works well for the local community. Dave cited what sounds to me like a questionable example. Do you have a view?
Well, I think you can have a view that shows good examples and bad examples on both sides. Good examples of private ownership, equally bad ones, but then with community ownership as well, where things have worked and where things have gone pear-shaped. I suppose this is where I'm coming back to the historical context. The idea of duchas and trusteeship and heritage and mutual responsibility all sounds great, but to what extent is that kind of historical perspective manipulated to address I'm not. The thought that's coming to me is more sort of communist ends. But I don't really mean to be as extreme as that.
Yeah.
Because at the end
That's
of the day,
good.
that would be what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, at the back.
Isn't there a sense in from the biblical theology, there's a sense of communism, community, and how much do we live in community, and how much, without history, do we have any meaning? The whole thing is we look back in the Old Testament, New Testament, whatever, that's historical, isn't it, really? So it's connected to us and we're connected to it. So what happens in the past has a huge influence on us today. And debunking or ignoring the past, David talks about Gaeldom, but we know that Gaeldom was the whole of Scotland. It wasn't just a small section, it wasn't the Highlands and Islands, but it was the whole of the land. We all spoke Gaelic at one time, even the people from Strathclyde, from Strathclyde and places like that. So history is very important, and it has a bearing on today. And as we look back historically in Scotland, people were very connected to the land. Before we get to maybe the end of the first millennium. So I think that although we don't want to perpetuate what happened in Sutherland or whatever in the sense of dragging old ghosts, I think that historically looking at our nation and people in the land use by the people, that the land were connected. My own theological understanding is that we were made from the land, from the dust. So connection with the land is ultimately spiritually important for people, and I just wonder where I'm not really come to a place myself in the understanding of the city and the growth and the beginning of the city in the Old Testament, and how that has an influence on us as human beings, what happens to us in the city. And the growth of the city and things like that. So I feel that looking, as predominantly city dwellers, although we're still obviously Scotland's, what can the impact does that have on land reform? What about people who live in the cities and their use of land? forget history. I think it would be wrong to debunk it, but I think listen to what the lady said, not to pull the bad stuff, but to look at the good things that were happening in our history as a nation would be important.
Thank you. Any other views you want to ask a question that hasn't yet at the back? You state your name, please.
I was just wondering, would you be willing, well, obviously going by the idea that land is money and money is power, I think that's probably at the back of the sort of reform in one sense. Would you also, and you quoted from the verse, the earth is the Lord's, but it also says the fullness thereof as well, which covers everything. So would you think of broadening out the transparency of who owns what to other businesses and property, rather than just people who own land? Because a lot of the power is coming from people who own all these big businesses, and then they sort of metamorphosize into some other sort of business, and they're getting all these big contracts. So I mean, they are the people with power as well. It's not just landowners.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Do you want to respond to that?
Just maybe very quickly. Yeah. It's a very good point. Company law has been created over many centuries. What you're hinting at there is that it can be used as a cover, it can be used as a way to limit liability for individuals. It can be used as a way of amassing massive power. It can be used as a way of avoiding paying tax, like some of the multinationals have managed to do. Big companies in the UK paying tiny amounts of tax. So yeah, that whole system needs to be looked at. I don't think it's in my gift to change all of that today. That's a huge job, a massive job. It's what you're looking at there is not just the establishment in the UK. You're talking about the establishment in the world, and a very powerful establishment that has created a system that allows all of that to happen. Yeah, we should tackle it. It'll take an awful long time, I would think, and it'll not be easy.
Yeah. One of the greatest forces for good that's ever been invented in the world is capitalism. Capitalism has delivered the greatest increase in human wealth and happiness over the last probably 300-400 years. And at the essence of capitalism, and this actually came out from a lot of thinking in the Scottish Enlightenment, is the concept of the limited company. And the limited company concept is dead simple. That is, you have protection as an investor. You can protect your private assets, your family home, by establishing this vehicle that is a limited company to trade. But the price for that is transparency. So you have to make available to the public who the owners of this private company are. So anybody can go and look up the share register and say who actually owns it, who the directors are, and every year look up how much this company is worth, what assets it holds, and what trading it's done. So in fact, I think we are already tackling this. We've tackled this for years because the invention of the limited company actually deals with that question of transparency. I think where you have a more serious issue are around organisations which are not limited companies, which are trusts, perhaps some of them trading in offshore tax havens, and I think there is a legitimate issue there about what more needs to be done to make sure we've got proper transparency if we're engaging them as part of our market world.
Do you want to come back? Or not?
Well, it is pretty complex.
Yeah, it's very complex, and it's beyond land reform. Land reform is easy in this sense. That there's a bit of ground that we're standing on today that you can figure out who owns it.
Well,
a company structure is far more complex and difficult. Question at the back.
Yes, I'm Dougal McPherson. I'm a retired chartered accountant. Lots of experience in both commerce and landowners and so on. This whole subject is fascinating, but it's also hugely complicated. And as you were talking about tenant farmers, I couldn't help thinking, how about starting with the supermarkets? Because the buying power that they have is one of the greatest pressures that tenant farmers have to cope with. If they were getting a decent price for their food that they have invested in growing and so on, they would be better able to pay the rent to the landlord, and maybe even an increased rent to the landlord. The other side of that cycle, of course, is the supermarkets would claim that they're producing cheap food for us to buy. A lot of it's cheap rubbish, and it's not good food at all. So there's and I'm saying this just demonstrates the complexity of the whole thing. You've made a point a few times, David, about how few people actually own land in Scotland. My observation would be that there's a lot of the land in Scotland, if it wasn't owned by these wealthy people, would not be in the good condition that it's in today. And a lot of these people, their investment in Scottish land actually leaves them out of pocket. They're not making profit out of it. They're not, they're not. But they are, as Murdo says, providing the local economy. And something like a river, okay, a salmon river is a very fragile asset, and it takes very little to destroy it. And we've said nothing about the sea, okay, because that's part of our heritage as well, and what we own. And until somebody does something, this is just a personal thing, until somebody does something about all the seals that are eating all the salmon that should be going up the rivers, then
Thanks, Dougal. You made me laugh. I heard Rob Gibson on Friday in a meeting say that this is land reform, and he went on to say, but of course, under the sea is land, so that should all be part of the agenda as well. And I thought, well, wait a minute, where does this stop? Dougal's point is about supermarkets and fair prices for tenant farmers and, I dare say, landowners as well. Maybe you mentioned already about taxation being a control mechanism here. Maybe Dougal's onto something here in that respect, because if somebody's not making a lot of money, then they don't have a lot of tax to pay.
Yeah. You're opening up a whole other area here, and it's fascinating. But there is a supermarket ombudsman now, to try and help, because it's very apparent to anybody who looks at the agricultural scene that the farmers are getting squeezed and the prices are getting squeezed. And there's nowhere clearer at the moment than in dairy. But that's partly because of a glut worldwide of milk, and it's causing all sorts of problems for dairy farmers in Scotland at the moment. And our committee has looked at that a few times this year. There's a limit to what government can do about these market forces, because the free market and capitalism and all that, the strong survive, the weak fall. And if that's a system you run by, that's a system you've got to accept. But governments are always expected to mitigate that, and that's quite right. And governments do, but there's a limit to what governments can actually do at the end of the day.
But from a Christian perspective, we should not accept the Darwinian idea that the weak fail. We should be working for the strengthening of the poor and for everybody in our society. I mean, that's.
Yeah.
I think we've probably ever been around.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Where does that put Christians in relation to capitalism? For or against? Or do we need to modify it? And if you're going to modify it, to what extent do you modify it to look after the poor?
Does it not just mean you buy your shopping elsewhere? Murdo, do you want?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think anybody argues really for unrestrained capitalism, but the question is where you draw the line. And we've tried in history lots of alternatives to capitalism. Believe me, capitalism's better, right? We can debate that all afternoon. On the supermarket question, this is Dave's right, this is a really difficult one. We were having this debate 10 years ago. You could have said, look at the profits the supermarkets are making, they're all making all this money. Supermarkets aren't making money now. The profit margins are way down. You've seen the newcomers and Lidl and Aldi come in, are stealing the breakfast from Tesco and Morrison's and Sainsbury. I've heard from people in the industry there will be probably within the next 12 months a major casualty in the supermarket business. A major name will go bust because they cannot make the margin because it's got so tight. I'm not going to tell in this forum who I think that is, but you speak to me later. I'll tell you what shares you need to sell, Diddle.
Just what I need to do.
But conversely, you know, what do supermarkets deliver? They do deliver cheap food. If we're concerned about poverty, if we're concerned about low incomes, you know, if we're delivering good due to hot competition between Aldi and Lidl and Tesco, lower prices for the consumer, is that a bad thing? If it's keeping the cost of food down? So, how do we try and mitigate it from the supplier point of view? There's the supermarket ombudsman, a big debate about whether, you know, she's got enough power, whether she needs to be given more clout. I also think, from a farming point of view, I think the problem in relation to supply is you've got a classic mismatch of power, where you've got large multinational buyers on one side of the table and a very, very fragmented industry on the other. And I think part of the answer is for the producers to work together a lot more to try and drive up prices. So they try and even out this imbalance in power between people on different sides of the table. Now, that doesn't work if the supermarkets can say, right, we're going to bypass home producers and import from elsewhere. But if the consumer's thinking, actually, no, I want to buy Scottish or British produce because I think there's a value attached to that, then it's harder for the supermarket to get around it. But there is no easy answer to this.
Thank you. Time for one last question, Elaine. Yeah.
Elaine Watt, I'm a planner with Highland Council. I'm interested, we've talked and heard about social justice, we've heard about community benefit, and I suppose and I was listening to the gentleman at the back, I didn't catch his name, in terms of what happens for people in the cities and the towns, as well as we've got the farming interests and interests in agriculture. I suppose my question is, housing is a big issue in Scotland. The government are encouraging us to build. We need houses. I know the housing waiting list in Ireland is huge. We need land for housing. And I suppose, I'm not quite sure what my question is, but there has to be a balance in finding, what is community benefit for all the people that are in towns and cities? How can they benefit from land? How can we provide things, facilities that are going to benefit people? And how do we balance the need for housing, for more land for housing with, as I think as you said, there's a lot of the land around the towns and cities are where your most profitable farming land is. It's what we keep coming back to, it's a complex issue. But I'd be interested in your comments around that.
It may or may not be helpful, Elaine, but there's a very good example of this in Inverness. The Scottish Government owns a farm, Knocknagale, which is used for the bull stud, for crofters, throughout the crofting communities. And the idea was that ground, which is prime location for housing on the south side of Inverness, that land would go for housing. Now, the Scottish Government looked at that and decided that they would only sell one field, I think, ultimately, but they've kept the farm and they've reinvested in the bull stud, because on this occasion, the crofters' cows were more important than the houses in Inverness. That's maybe a slight exaggeration, but it's a good example, I think, of Elaine's point. What about the housing issue? Thanks for raising it. It's a good question, Elaine.
I know Knocknagale Farm very well because I grew up right beside it. My parents still live there, so and it's really interesting because over the last 40 years we've seen Inverness slowly encroach southwards, houses getting ever closer to that particular site. I find this whole issue of housing a fascinating one because, why is property so expensive in Scotland? We're not short of land, but lots of land. So why is it so expensive? And I mean, in my previous life, I was a lawyer. We used to do a lot with a lot of agricultural clients who, at that point, my practice was in Edinburgh. We had a lot of agricultural clients around Edinburgh and the Lothians who sat on land and if they got planning permission for houses, the value of the land went up by a multiple of, 100 overnight. And why is land so expensive? Because we limit its supply for housing. The actual cost of building a house is not that, relatively, it's not that great. So it's in the land that the price is, but agricultural land is not that expensive. So it's the fact that if you give it planning permission, it shoots up in value. So the question comes from a planner, so I don't want to blame the planner. But my point essentially is that because we restrict the supply of land for housing, not because we're short of land, but because we don't give it planning permission, that artificially drives up the price of housing. And going back to what we're saying about social justice and poverty, we as a collectively as a people, compared to many European countries, are spending a far higher share of our income on housing costs. Why? Because we restrict the supply of land to build houses. And going back to the broader debate about rural Scotland and the economy of rural Scotland, it always seemed to me that you've got this mismatch. And on the one hand, there's this huge demand for housing that's not being met because we don't have the supply. On the other hand, we've lots of people, family farms, for example, which would love to have the income from selling a building plot, say one building plot a year, to supplement the income and keep agriculture alive and help deal with these issues about low prices. But we just can't seem to join this together. We can't seem to say, how do we release more land for housing, make housing more affordable, but also provide an income to those working on the land? And I don't know the answer to that. I just know it's a bit of a mess at the moment.
Thank you, Murdo.
Very helpful, Murdo.
What's the answer then?
He's quite right in a sense that there's no shortage of land. Just drive a few miles out of Dingwall and there's loads of land everywhere. Head west, there's even more of it. The problem is a combination of things. It's people land banking, buying land and sitting on it because they know it will get in value, borrowing money against it, as was mentioned earlier on, so they're quite happy it sits doing nothing because it's their collateral. It's some landowners, not all, who won't give land for any development on their estate because they don't want anything to encroach. It's the planning system that restricts house plots in rural areas. There's a planning review going on just now, out for consultation, so all write in about this. I believe there should be a presumption in favour of rural housing, not a presumption against. If every single farmer in Crofter in the Highlands could sell off a plot of land, or give a plot at the very least to a son or a daughter, you would solve half the housing problem in the Highlands overnight. But what you would also do, and this might worry Murdo, having advocated this just now, if you open it up too much, if you force an awful lot more land onto the market, the value of that land starts to plummet. So all the people that have already got a house, the value of their property starts to plummet. So their £250,000 house is suddenly only worth £200,000 and they're in negative equity. So how do you deal with that? You have to adjust these things gradually. We've got where we are through a crazy system that talks about housing being an investment. Housing is a home. That's what it should be. And we should be making sure there are more homes. So we need to change the whole psyche and we need to adjust things so that land values stop shooting into the sky, steady off, and over time become a much smaller proportion of the value of a home. So we can do these things, and giving a presumption in favour of rural housing and not worrying too much about ribbon development and things like that. Let people build houses out in our rural and country areas so that young folk can actually get a home at a reasonable price. Because if you don't do that, the only people you're going to get living in our rural areas, and you can see it very markedly round the Inner Firth area, as soon as you get out of the towns, the only folk who live there are either folk who have always lived there and they've got their farmer croft, or very wealthy people who can afford to pay the inflated prices of land and housing around these areas. Just look at the demographics and you'll see right away that I'm correct in that.
I'm just thinking about Puri Lane, the planner's head has exploded with the idea that it's a free-for-all. Like, do you want to go back?
These are only my views, by the way, not the Scottish Government's.
No, not at all. I think there'd be a couple of things I would say that, and I totally agree, influence policy, because at the moment land is restricted. We can, 10 years I worked in policy, I don't do that now, but I don't know how many times I've been out around communities saying, please talk to us about where you want land allocated for housing and everything else. But we're talking about housing. Where do you want your land allocated? But if landowners are not prepared to have their land allocated, there's no point in us allocating it. If they're not prepared to let people build, there's no point in allocating. So it's limited by that, I think. So getting in there with the development plan and influencing what's going into our development plans, which is open for everybody, I think is greatly important. And I would always encourage people, write in, say what you think. If you've got a bit of land that you think should be allocated for housing, write in and see if we can, see if you can get it put in the plans. I think in relation to housing in the countryside, we have a housing in the countryside policy. It covers the Inner Firth, which is the area that I work in. But I also work out with the hinterland area, where housing is encouraged in the countryside. It can be anywhere. But I also think, as from a Christian point of view, and this is, I suppose, partly where my faith comes in too, the importance of protecting the land that we have and protecting. I think Jamie spoke at the start about the conservation and of the land and of species as well, and all sorts of things. I think we have a duty to look after what we have, the heritage of the land that we have, and to see vast areas of countryside covered in houses everywhere. It's a question that people will have different views on it. I suppose that's what from a planning point of view, you're looking to protect as well, to protect the sort of style of the history of our communities, as well as just providing housing wherever it can go. So we've got a land that we can enjoy, places that we can enjoy. There are exceptions within the hinterland policy that do allow people to build. They are, and we often work very closely with people to try and find land. When they come in and say, I've got this area of land I own, I want to build a house, we sit down with them and say, right, well, you're not going to be able to build it there, but you could build, you can meet an exception if you build it over here. We work with people to try and make that happen where it's possible.
Thank you. David wants to come in and look at it.
Two very small points, as I talked here. One very interesting point is that land values over the last 30 years, when we've gone through 3 property cycles, including 2 serious property crashes, have continued to rise year on year and have never been affected by the crash in property values. And about turning land and getting it zoned for housing, I mean, there is something intrinsically wrong when I can be part of a deal which turns single figures acres into a 7-figure sum just because you've now attracted the right to build houses on it. And these 2 points are linked, value, and we talked about, if we're being truthful, we start talking about Christian ethical response to land and land reform, the value of land plays a real part in that.
It feeds in as well, if I can say, to the whole issue of greed and exploitation, where that sort of thing can happen. There's temptation for people to do things for the wrong reasons, and
You should say it wasn't my land.
Final comment at the back, please.
I can also make a point. I think maybe as from a Christian perspective, I think dealing with this secularisation of society in general, and you mentioned conservation, which is important. But I think as a society, we're beginning to worship the creation rather than the creator more. and we're getting ourselves tied up in knots about this conservation, which isn't beneficial. I mean, a lot of stuff that they're wrong. You know, that people are talking about conserving. It's been there for generations. It's still there, but it's almost like we're about to lose it now. You know.
Yeah. We'll maybe get a little bit more from Hector or Damien on that later on this afternoon. I was heartened that we finished there on a note of consensus between our two guest MSPs. It's fantastic to hear. Thank you both very much, gentlemen, for giving us your time this morning into this afternoon. Will you join me in saying thank you?